going here. It's about 12:01 my time, so I'm sure we'll still have some people come trickling in. That's perfectly fine. So we'll get it rocking and rolling. My name's Abby Holovach. I'm really excited to be here today to be able to give you guys this presentation. This is one of my favorite presentations to give. Most of these photos I've taken myself, so it's all things I've seen firsthand. So I love being able to share that with other like-minded professionals, hopefully give you some tips and tricks, and ways to avoid potential issues in the future, whether it's just compliance or best management practices. So, role-playing for success, thinking like an environmental regulator. So just a little bit about me. I am from Fort Worth, Texas. So it's like, 75 here today. So we definitely have the AC going, but, very strange weather, very strange times. But I am the owner of Vibe Environmental. So I have been full-time with my business since last July. So one-woman show, but I've been having a blast doing all sorts of things under the sun when it comes to environmental health and safety. Training, compliance support. I love what I do. So I'm really pleased and happy where I'm at today with my business. So having a great time. Previous experience, I also worked at Holtcat as a compliance manager there. I was their environmental compliance manager, locations in Texas and Oklahoma. So dealing with heavy equipment, mechanic shops, etc. I also worked for a spill and hazmat response company for a good chunk of time, CG Environmental, which is now EnviroServe. But I worked there for about 6 years as their EHS and waste director, so saw a little bit of everything in that role. So a lot of things we talk about today are lessons learned as well, things I saw in that position. I also worked at a joint reserve base here in Fort Worth in their environmental program, which was an interesting experience to be able to see things from the federal perspective and how they operate. So it's obviously, different in a lot of cases. But my first environmental job was with TCEQ, so Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is our environmental regulators here in Texas. So I was an environmental investigator, specifically in the waste section. So that's really where, my one true love with waste began. You may hear my chicken crowing. That is a chicken on the screen on the far right. His name is Harriet. He's my one and only chicken. He is a silky rooster, so he's got those white fluffy feathers all up and down his body. He's a little small bantam chicken, but he whoops my cats. He will jump on their back and flap and rip their fur out. So, and his name is Harriet because we got him as a day old chick, and we did not know that he was a male until one day he crowed, and we're like, well, too late. So you may hear him crowing. If you hear screeching, that's Harriet. He's saying hello. All right. So like I said, though, this is one of my favorite presentations to give. Again, this is all real world things that I've seen, real photos. So the point of this session is to really go through how do we get into the mindset of being an environmental regulator within our own facilities. So, how do we get into that mindset, which is sometimes a little bit difficult, especially when you get in the day-to-day, things we're used to seeing, our plates are really full. But the goal here is to be prepared for an unexpected or an expected inspection to where, it's always going to be stressful, but maybe it won't be as stressful because you're prepared. You already have all your answers up front and you know what they're looking for. So we want to try to find a way to detach ourselves, really change the lens through which we're viewing our own facility. So that way we can better capture and correct those gaps before they ever show up, which is, hopefully one of our biggest goals, correct it ourselves before a regulator does. So that's what we're really going to focus on during the presentation here is how can we accomplish this? How can we get into this mindset and get into this mindset of unbiased observations? Again, stepping away and viewing from someone else's perspective, what would that look like? If a random person off the street or a regulator came into your facility, what are they going to see? What assumptions are they going to make? So when we say role playing for success, that's our goal, getting into this regulatory mindset. So a few things we'll focus on. What does it look like? So we don't want to have to be in the position where you're like, no, it's not what you think, I promise. And then you have to go into a lengthy explanation about what's actually going on. If you've ever had to do that, especially when a regulator is on site, then you really are going to start sweating bullets because you're, stumbling over your words and trying to explain. So I promise it's not what it seems. So anything we can do to make it obvious up front, and we're going to talk about some tactics to ways to do this. How can we eliminate this question, or this situation? What does it look like is going on here? We also want to consider how much explanation is needed. So whether it's with, our waste management, or perhaps it's with how we manage our, paint booths, whatever it may be, we want to have all the answers up front. We know what they're going to ask for. And if we can get in that regulator's mindset, we're going to be able to anticipate the question and have this answer ready, and not have to sit here and be like, oh no, I can explain. We're already ready. We're prepared. And then, of course, considering the fact that, and we know this, if you're in an EHS role of any sort, we can't give any excuses because they're not going to care. And I had to deal with that a lot working in hazmat, just because we had guys coming and going, spills, all days and times, at night, during the day, 24/7. So, of course, a lot of excuses, we've got to get to the next spill. No, there's things we have to do. We can't just rush through this process. And of course, we know all well and good that it's a battle we'll always continue to fight, no matter what role you're in. People are always going to have excuses, but we want to try to identify those again up front and try to put it in the perspective as well to our team, why it's important that those things are addressed and corrected in real time. And then having that critical eye, like we said, looking at it from a regulator's perspective. And really utilizing tools that the regulators are using. And I'll show you some resources for that as well. So looking at it from their critical eye and being, pretty nitpicky, let's put it that way. And it may be frustrating to those if you're doing this during an annual audit, but it's going to save everybody a lot of time, effort, blood, sweat, and tears in the long run. And then last but not least, not showing yourself any mercy. So again, we don't want those excuses to creep in. We don't want to try to, lessen the blow to our teams. We'd rather have this information come from you or us internally versus a regulator. And sometimes it may come down to, us changing things completely in a way that maybe we've been doing things that isn't correct. So it may be kind of something that we have to deal with in terms of our ego. We thought we were doing something right. Come to find out we're not. Don't show yourself any mercy either. We just got to get it corrected and get on the straight and narrow. So the guidelines, as we look through all these photos, some things we're going to consider here. No tribal knowledge. So in this context, basically, if you pull a random person off the street and they're staring at, your operations and how you're managing your environmental program, are they going to be able to figure it out easily? Again, or is it going to take a lot of explanation, a lot of explaining? It's going to be a problem, especially for a regulator. No historical knowledge. Again, we don't want to hear things like, oh, everybody knows that's how we do that here. Okay, well, everybody doesn't know. If you're having to explain it, they probably don't know. And that's where things even like where you store empty containers, having a sign that simply says empty containers. Again, goes back to tribal knowledge and no historical knowledge. Lets people know right up front. No assumptions, which goes back to what does it look like? So it needs to be very, very clear about, for example, if something says contaminated rags, who really knows what that means? Contaminated with what? So it even goes back to just basic compliance when it comes to labeling and how we're communicating that information out. Assume the worst. Like we said, what does it look like is going on here? And if it looks like something bad, that's how a regulator is going to see it. So we want to make sure no matter what the situation is, even if it is in compliance and it just looks bad, we need to get it to where it no longer looks bad. Because again, a regulator is going to assume the worst and then they're really going to start digging. And utilize that critical prying eye into your own operations, really asking those questions that maybe you've never asked before. And we'll talk about some examples of that as well. And then last but not least, not factoring in emotions or any excuses. Like we said, we've all heard every excuse under the sun. We all know everybody's got an excuse. Sometimes people will get, again, the ego comes in, emotions about the way certain things have been done in the past and come to find out we've not been doing it right. Again, we want to try to find a way to remove those emotions, those excuses, and look from the regulator's perspective. So we're going to start with some signage and labeling, look at some real-world examples of that, and then we'll move into waste and product management areas, looking from that regulator's perspective. And then we'll also talk about spill preparedness and what that looks like from not only a compliance perspective, but also just from a proactivity perspective. So those are kind of the three main areas that we're going to focus on. Of course, I could sit here and probably talk to you about this stuff for, 2 whole days, but we've got an hour. So that's the three things that we're going to focus on, the high points. All right, so when it comes to signage and labeling, some things that investigators are always going to be looking for. So, of course, can they immediately identify waste in product containers? So if there's any question and they're having to do 360s around containers, trying to figure out exactly what's inside, again, asking a lot of questions, it's not immediately clear, going to be a red flag. They're going to look for immediate identification of waste in product management areas. So that's really important. Again, may not be in the regulation saying you have to have this or that. You know, you may be a very small quantity generator or something like that, and you don't have to establish like satellite accumulation areas or anything like that. Again, though, we still want to designate areas because it is the best management practice. If we've got containers scattered around a facility, it's not going to be a good look. Consistent labels and signage, again, without confusion, conflicting information. They shouldn't have to ask more than one question. They should just be able to look, identify, and move along, which is what we all want. We don't want them to linger and start digging around. So our goal here for this section, how do we eliminate the question, what's that? So this is one of my biggest points anytime I visit a facility is if at any instance, if you have to walk around and ask, what's that? That means that there's probably not adequate labeling, whether it's waste or product. So even getting into like, you know, OSHA HAZCOM territory and those secondary and primary containers, it's no different, you know, of course, on the waste side. So this is our goal here. How do we eliminate that question? So real world photos, here we go. So obviously on first glance, we already know, you know, not looking so hot here. Immediately, we can't identify what these containers are. There's no clear and obvious labels. Not to mention, there's no aisle space here to be able to walk between the containers. The containers don't look in good condition. They're not closed. So, you know, a regulator obviously would have a heyday with this situation. And just to note, sometimes it depends on what investigator you get. I've had some investigators that have come in and maybe spent 5 minutes inside the facility. And you're like, oh, okay. And then I've been the regulator where I was so terrified of missing something that I spent, you know, like 4 hours in a dry cleaner. Way too long. So you just don't know who you're going to get. So we want to assume you're going to get someone like me who's going to spend an incredible amount of time looking and sniffing around. So that's kind of the perspective we're looking at this from. So of course, I would come in here and be able to say violation, violation, violation. Even if those labels, let's say, are on the sides and we just can't see it on the front, what's going to happen here? The regulator is going to have to walk up and start looking. Now they're looking deeper into what's going on back here versus them just being able to walk up if the orientation had been turned and we could see the labels. Maybe they just walk up and keep on walking. But in this case, it may be properly labeled, but we're putting ourselves in just a more vulnerable position if they can't see it, and not to mention your people. They may not be able to see it. So this is a common issue I see. So we've got drums that are connected to a filter system, basically. So this was from a metal cutting operation, and so this system was sucking out the metal particulate and little small chunks and was filtering it down into these drums. But of course, what am I going to ask as a regulator as soon as I walk up to those drums? Well, what is that? What are these? You know, and now the conversation starts. Well, okay, well, what's their waste classification? What are you doing with them? Where are they going, et cetera, versus you just have label them correctly in the first place. Again, oriented, so they're facing out. All the regulator has to do is walk by, or your own employees, those people working there, it's immediately obvious what these containers are. There's no confusion. There's no need to ask questions. Again, we're eliminating the question, what's that? Even with containers that are attached during some type of process. Again, if it's a waste looking type container or it's collecting material, get it clearly labeled. Now, see this one all the time as well. So upon first glance of these, we see product labels on there. But come to find out, these were actually empty drums that were going for disposal. But as a regulator, what are they going to do? I know what I would do. You walk up and you start shaking them. Is there anything in these? Are these full? Are these empty? What's going on here? You know, what is that? Now, here come the questions. We've opened up the floodgates versus us just getting simple signage. If they want to store empty drums in this area, they're RCRA empty, get a sign that says RCRA empty containers only. And then that way, as a regulator walks up, it makes it really obvious. There's literally a sign right there that says empty containers. And your people know now. You got a new guy, now they see that signage. Oh, this is where I need to put my containers. So win-win for everybody. So I think we know off first glance, not looking good here. So these lead acid batteries, we don't know, as a regulator or just someone walking by, a new employee, is this product, is this waste? What is that? What's going on here? Are those new batteries? Are they old batteries? What are you doing with them? You know, is it universal waste? Are you sending them for, you know, reclamation, or what's going on here? Come to find out, these were waste batteries, which were being managed as universal waste, but no identification. Obviously not being, you know, stored properly, just the way they're stacked. So again, open ourselves up for questions here versus simple signage that maybe says universal waste batteries. Got a little spot to write in with an expo marker, the date of starting accumulation. Problem solved. Simple fix. Now, this always makes me cringe when I'm at a facility and they're using drums or waste containers for trash cans and they're not identified as such. So again, you look down here as a regulator, what are we going to think? We see a 55-gallon drum. You know, we also see that smaller 25, 30-gallon drum right there, 20, 30, whatever that little guy is. But again, we don't know what those are. All we see is drums. So what are they going to do? They're going to walk over there. Now they're going to open them and start looking around. What's inside? What is that? Come to find out, it's supposed to just be for regular trash. But what happens if now they look inside and there's unpunctured aerosols in there? Now, again, the floodgates have opened. So obviously a multiple layer issue here, but encourage you, if you do have waste containers where you're just using them for regular trash, label it just trash only, MSW trash only. That way everybody knows, not only at your facility, but also the regulators, hey, that's only supposed to be for regular trash. Versus right now, it's kind of up for question. We don't know. So, obvious issue. Now, reusing containers. So again, another facility here. We don't really know exactly what's happening with this container. It's got a strange lid. We can clearly see the Class 3 flammable liquid label. So what's the regulator going to do? What's that? What's going on here? Coming to find out, when you opened it up, there were crushed aluminum cans inside, like soda cans. That's what they were using it for. So again, cover that, remove that, and just simply put on the side, stencil it. That's where you want to put your aluminum soda cans for recycled, then just say that. Just put a simple label on here. Again, you answer the question up front, what is that? Now, these always make me chuckle because somebody tried, but just gives us more questions than answers at this point. So it's just a tote sitting here with liquid inside, and all it says is bad. You're like, bad what? Bad, is it bad fuel? Is this waste now? Like, what are we doing with this material? So again, we've opened up Pandora's box here because the regulator is now going to walk over and start asking all these same questions. Bad what? Does anybody even know what this stuff is? So again, want to make sure it's clearly identified. Another case, again, where someone was trying but didn't quite get there. In Texas, there's no such thing as residual waste. I know in some other states there is an actual waste classification called residual waste. But in this case, Texas, there is not. So, of course, I was doing a facility walk and came across this and had to ask, you know, residual what? Like, I don't know what that means. Residual oil, residual solvent, like, who knows what that means? So, again, we have actually more questions now than answers. Now, this was inside of a paint booth, and this was a problem that we see commonly where we have product mixed with waste, mixed with just junk. So in the back here, they had spent filters for the system. They had spent blasting media. They also, because this was a blaster, it was connected to the paint booth. So they had a little mix of everything here in terms of the waste as well as product. And then it started opening up more questions like, okay, well, what do you do with your spent filters from the neighboring paint booth? Because I see them sitting here in bags. What are you going to do with it? And actually, when I asked that, they were like, oh, we put them in the regular trash. And you're like, oh, so now we've got another violation, unauthorized disposal, and, you know, of potentially hazardous waste into the regular trash can. So I think, you know, most of us can see a lot of issues here, you know, pretty clearly. We have no idea what any of that stuff is. I know a lot of facilities also utilize different rag programs, different laundering programs. Again, we want to make sure it's clear what's happening with these rags? Are these, RCRA exempt? Are they going to be something where, again, they're being laundered and we're utilizing, some other waste classification, then it's not hazardous waste. It's not, going for disposal. Well, we need to make that clear on the label. Sometimes I used to like to put on my labels when I was running the 10-day, actually what regulatory citation I was using. And the reason I would do that is because you may get an investigator who comes in and has never heard of, any of these exemptions or exclusions, whichever one you're utilizing. And then now they're trying to give you a hard time about it because they've never heard of it. But if you have that citation on the label, they literally can just take a picture of that and then they'll go back, look it up and be like, oh, okay, versus again, you trying to explain it and being like, oh, well, under, and you can't remember exactly what it is. Again, just opens yourselves up to more problems. So even with materials like this, again, think ahead, go beyond compliance. What's going to answer those questions for them before they even have to ask? And then, of course, just double checking your facilities, making sure the right types of labels are being used. I've been to some facilities where it looked like somebody found a roll of universal waste labels and just went to town. Like everything in the facility was labeled as universal waste. And they were like, well, these are the only ones we had. I'm like, which I think most of us know is not going to fly. Same for this instance. This was actually used oil. It was not waste oil. There is a distinction. So used oil is, contaminated as a result of use versus waste oil would be like, hydraulic oil tank bottoms. It's not actually been used. So this is a different waste classification. So this was improperly labeled. But again, we want to go through and look from the regulator's perspective. And sometimes it may be a cultural shift. They may be so used to calling it waste oil, and that's a pet peeve of mine. I'm like, that's wrong. It's used oil. I see it all the time, though. A lot of these facilities and people who've been just calling it that forever. Even some waste vendors I've worked with, and I'm like, shuddering. I'm like, stop. So we want to double check. And again, is it product? Is it waste? So we see these two containers sitting here of clearly corrosive material. We've got the UN number, the identification number at least, so we're able to go look up, and kind of see what's going on here. But nevertheless, we don't know, is this waste? Is it product? And as a regulator, we start to ask the questions like, again, what is this? How long have these been here? And then you start asking people around the shop and come to find out these had been sitting there for, 6 months. And at that point, we're looking abandoned, looking like solid waste. So definitely another issue that could potentially lead to more violations. Not to mention their positioning, just, sitting there just waiting to get run into with a forklift or something and lead to a spill event. And then here's a great example. This is a good example. What I always recommend, again, we just say, we even if this is not required by the regulations, this is what we're saying. Eliminate the question of what is that? Trash. Yeah, we know, oh, okay, it's trash. And the regulators still probably will go look inside to confirm. I know I did when I was at TCEQ, and I'll still do that at people's facilities because you see all sorts of things in the garbage. Rags, like we said, the aerosols. We may see, partially used chemicals put in there. Absorbent pads, always see those all the time. But again, if we try to help our team and the regulators with simple things like this, it's going to make a big difference. So wrapping up the signage section. So signage and identification. Again, we want to eliminate the question, what's that? If we can do that, we're ahead of the game. So clearly identifiable. They need to be legible. We also don't want a bunch of mixed labels. Again, it should be very clear what's inside. Orient those containers with the labels so that they can be clearly seen. Again, we don't want somebody to have to go all the way around the container trying to find the label. It may be there. You may be compliant, but make it easy. And train your team to do that with the containers as well. Make sure those labels stand out. They're easy to find. Like I said, if you're reusing a container and it's permitted because it's in terms of like you're reusing a non-haz container for non-haz material, I caution against putting hazardous materials into old containers you're trying to reuse. The reason I say that is they may not be rated to hold that material. So I see that all the time as well. But if you are reusing a container, and, it's all kosher in terms of, shipping it and the type of container, make sure we don't have a bunch of old labels on there. Some facilities will just take a Sharpie and like cross through the old label and then put another label on there. And now we've got, 5 different labels on there. It's very confusing. So cover those old labels or markings. And if you can, use things like floor markings, row signage, again, even simple things that say just like waste management area, empty container area. Even those simple things make it so much easier on your team and the regulators, because again, we're answering those questions up front. What is that? We shouldn't have to ask it. All right, so let's move on to waste and product management areas. So regulators and investigators are going to be looking for, of course, clean and tidy waste management areas, your operational and storage areas. Really, I always say compliance. If you have good housekeeping, you're 75% of the way there. Because if a regulator walks into a facility, and we'll look at some pictures here in a second that I've taken that were heinous, and it just looks gross, maybe in compliance, but it just doesn't look good. It doesn't look like there's any TLC given. Things are not organized. It's messy. It's not going to give them a good feeling. The vibes are going to be bad. And then they're going to start digging further because they're going to be like, ooh, these people don't seem to care about housekeeping. Look at the appearance. We may need to spend some additional time here versus them coming in and things, look clean, good housekeeping. It's going to give them the warm fuzzies. And that may lessen the time that they're there, which is what we all want. They're going to look for clearly designated management areas. So we'll look at some examples of that, good and bad. Storage on impervious surfaces. Again, where exactly are you situating your waste management areas? Is it going to be somewhere where, again, you have a worst case scenario? Where's that material going to go? Is it near busy areas with a lot of traffic, or, access where anybody can walk by and get into that area? All things we want to consider. And then very low hanging fruit, closed containers. Of course, we know things like drums, totes, they need to be closed, but we'll look at some, sometimes less obvious things that could get us a violation. So the goal here in this section, demonstrate organization and cleanliness upon first glance. Like we said, we want to give them the warm fuzzies. We want them to feel good when they're coming in. And I keep putting this from the perspective of the regulator. Of course, I just want this to be a given. All of these things also, like I've said, benefit your facility, your employees. I mean, this really is a win-win all the way around. I'm just framing this from a regulator's perspective. So, all right, so bad example here, of course, coming up behind this facility. You couldn't really see this from the front, but looked heinous from the back. And I always find it funny, and this is just me being cynical, but I love when I go to a facility and it's like beautiful up at the front. They've got like all this like shrubbery and flowers, and like really nice lobby. And then you go to the back and it's like a freaking dump, like, and you're like, come on, it's like this mask, and they take it off and they're like hideous, It was kind of what was going on here. So in the back, they had all of these drums and containers, many of which were full. Some were empty, but many were not. But we had no way of knowing or telling what was full, what was empty. Some of these are flipped upside down, which is supposed to be the universal symbol they're empty. But I got to tell you, I've seen drums flipped upside down that were not empty. So again, we want to have very clearly designated management areas where empties are over here, signs identify it, full containers over here. Maybe I've even established rows in terms of different waste streams. Then it makes it very, very easy to know and keep track of exactly what you've got on hand and what you can anticipate you need to ship out. So obviously a whole host of issues here. We're not on concrete. We don't have any, containment. We're exposed to the elements, just a hot mess. And then not to mention the totes over there that were actually filled with used oil that had literally 4 different labels on there. I wish I had saved the photo of that because it was terrible. I was like, what is this? But also not on a impervious surface, right on the gravel, just asking for a potential spill, potential release, especially sitting out in the sun, getting dilapidated. This would be a good example. So this was something that I helped establish at one of the facilities. Obviously not ideal that it was outdoors. Again, sometimes, real world, we have to deal with the hand that we've been dealt. And it wasn't out of compliance. We'll put it that way. In a perfect world, this would have been covered, indoors, but there was just simply no space for it. But this was at least an area where we could put protection up in terms of the bollards with the chains. We've got rows. The signs actually have the different waste streams and actually had a picture of what waste label they should use for those waste streams. So that just keeps it really simple for your people. And when a regulator comes in, they know exactly what they're looking at. Makes it super easy for everybody involved. Now, when we talk about closed containers, I'm sure a lot of us have dealt with funnel issues. So perfect example right here. So these drums were inside of a paint booth. So of course, gonna have a lot of overspray. That's why they have covered the drums. The waste transporter would not pick those containers up because they had overspray on them. They actually made them paint them black in order to pick them up. Try explaining that to the crew. You got to paint them black. So to eliminate that, they started covering the drums with bags. But nevertheless, not ideal because now we can't see the labels. Not to mention they shouldn't have really had a lot of materials like this inside the paint booth. But big thing here is the open funnel. So we can see that's clearly a funnel sitting right here. It had no latching, locking lid. So if something happened and this, somebody backed into this, it's just going to go spilling all over the floor and immediately releasing. So very low hanging fruit for regulators are those funnels. So if you know you're getting an inspection or an inspector arrives, we'll talk about kind of preparing for that here in a few minutes, but have somebody go around before you start walking out there and make sure those suckers are sealed. Make sure they are actually shut. Because again, depending on the regulator you get, may think they're the next, Aaron Brockovich and may be like, that tote doesn't have a lid. Gotcha. Or you may have a nice one who's just like, close it. But not a gamble you want to take. So this situation right here, obviously, not looking so hot. So that was a scrap metal container that's right behind in the bin with those empty cylinders. But they specifically what we're looking at is their process for aerosol management. So they were actually puncturing these aerosol cans, which is fine as part of their process. They had a puncture unit attached to a drum. But how they would move them from the shop over to this waste management area was in these containers right here, in these drums, or not drums, these trash cans with wheels. So they were dropping them through that top hole, and they simply labeled them, first of all, used aerosols, which at that point, sitting there like that, they should have been labeled as universal waste aerosols. And then once they were punctured, they were actually putting those cans into scrap metal, and that drum was going out as universal paint waste. It's one of our universal waste here in Texas. But nevertheless, a regulator could say that those containers are technically open. Again, you could get someone who is very nitpicky. You can see the hole in the top. Obviously, the way they're all scattered on top is no bueno. But focusing on the closed container issue, again, technically an open container. So here's an aerosol puncture unit for you right here. But again, could open up more questions than answers that you may have. This is where we really have to start to ask ourselves questions from a regulator's perspective. Because I know the first thing I'm going to ask sitting here looking at this container is, first of all, when's the last time this container's filter was changed? The puncture unit's filter. We can see some dates on here, but I don't know why there's so many dates on there. It was only changed one time. It was from 2022. And then they're going to start to ask you questions like, well, what do you do with that filter when it's spent? And those are the types of questions when we really start to dig deep into our waste management areas, into some of our process equipment, we start to get answers we may not like. So a lot of times when you ask the question, when you're staring at a filter unit like this, or a filter on a piece of equipment, or as part of, your air emissions control system, you may have filters that are a part of that filtration unit. And again, if maintenance is taking care of it, what are they doing with the filters? And if we hear it's going into the regular trash, again, could lead to more potential violations. Again, things look aged. Things look old. We know this looks terrible. I mean, we just looking at this, of course, a regulator is going to be highly displeased. Clearly, this container has been sitting there for an extended period of time. It's sitting outdoors. It's rusted. There's not a whole lot of protection here. There's no containment, which isn't necessarily required, but we are required to prevent releases. That's really all they say in terms of the federal perspective. But we've got this very old faded label on there. And as soon as they see a faded label, that's going to raise red flags, because now they're going to think, well, how long has that been sitting there? And come to find out, looking at this label, it was longer than a year, and you've got 1 year to accumulate universal waste. So doesn't look good in terms of aesthetics. They're being weathered. Now we have containers, maybe they're questionable in terms of integrity, could lead to a release, and they've been there for too long. And then I always encourage folks to get with maintenance. Start looking in their nooks and crannies, because sometimes they've got a whole nother hot mess going on there. Because, a lot of times we get kind of laser focused on the high risk, high hazard things coming off of, from our main operations. And sometimes some of this peripheral stuff gets forgotten, overlooked. But again, we start looking around. What do we do with our old light bulbs? What do we do with our spent batteries? All of those things, again, we may start to get answers we don't like, or regulators not going to like. So very common example we see is like with universal waste lamp storage. Whether they're fluorescents, whether they're LEDs, we don't want to have open containers. And this is again, a very common violation. I've been to some facilities where they just had them like wrapped in a towel and like standing up in the corner, and you're like, what's going on here? So we don't want to forget about some of these, what I call just those peripheral wastes, where again, it may not be high priority, but you can still get a violation as a result. And then, of course, makes you cringe looking at it here. We've got containers that are sitting outside, very unclearly labeled. We don't really know what waste classification they are. It just says paint. It's sitting literally right next to the property line, where if there is a release, it's just going to go directly into the soil and gravel over there. All of those containers look weathered and aged. So this situation right here would, they'd probably get 4 or 5 violations from all of this when it's said and done. So pretty clearly not a good waste management area, not well planned out, not to mention just the treatment of the containers in general. Now in this area, this was at a retail facility, but they had there are 2 waste containers back here. But again, would we have any way of really knowing that? It's kind of amongst all this other stuff. We've got containers, boxes sitting on top of the waste containers. So again, we're going to invite that regulator to really start poking around now, because it doesn't look like it's very high priority. What about, your waste inspections? If they're required to do inspections, those, weekly inspections of the container storage area, whatever the requirements may be, it's just going to open more of the floodgates now, because you just kind of have it squished in there with everything else. It needs its own segregated space, the best that we can with the space that we have. Now, when we talk about closed containers, here's another one right here. So this was a facility that makes concrete product. And so this was from their air emission system. So it was funneling down all of this particulate concrete powder into these bags. Well, what do you think is going to happen? They're not, and this, again, not all, sometimes it's easier said than done to come up with a solution for this. How are we going to prevent that material from just puffing out the top? Because everything going into those bags was waste. So again, we need to label them. We need to identify and let people know exactly what's inside those bags. And not to mention the fact that now not only are we concerned about, waste management, but also from the air perspective, and the fact that all of that is, an uncontrolled emission right there and release of all of this concrete powder waste at this point. So twofold issue here. Again, sometimes easier said than done to try to fix it though. Another example is where this unit, it was some type of like silica powdery material, but it was waste, and it was coming down through this process system and was being deposited into these roll-offs. Of course, great for the one on the left, it's covered, but if a regulator walked up and saw the one on the right uncovered, if they had, a stanky attitude, they could certainly give you a violation for that and call that an open waste container. And you could say, oh, well, it's because it has to drop down in here and, blah, 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 and you're trying to explain. And they're just going to see it black and white and be like, well, you need to have it covered when it's not actively depositing material into that waste container. So again, something else we have to try to kind of find creative solutions for and workarounds, because we know in the real world with real operations, there's not going to be some guy back there just like furiously like covering and uncovering these roll-offs. And we'll talk kind of about planning ahead during an investigation or an inspection, kind of some ways that, hopefully you can kind of get ahead of that. And then really checking your trash cans, looking and not overlooking, I should say. Again, some of these areas that are kind of in the peripherals. Get up there and look in your big dumpsters. Look in your scrap metal. Look in your MSW trash. What's going in there? Because a regulator is going to do it. So they may see those absorbent pads in there. What are they going to think? Again, they're going to assume worst case scenario here that those are oily absorbent pads. versus maybe they were just used to clean up water. But again, they're not going to know that. So they're going to assume the worst. So we have to as well. Again, looking for things like unpunctured aerosols, even just containers that still have hazard labels on them. It's going to raise red flags. So always check your trash cans. And then again, what's this? I mean, we know this gives everybody the heebie-jeebies. What is this going to look like to a regulator? You know, just same battery situation we kind of saw earlier, where we've got batteries that are, obviously those don't look new. They're not labeled. They're stacked improperly. There's no containment. And if you look up the universal waste regulations, again, very vague in terms of how it says we have to manage these waste areas for universal waste. It just basically is like prevent releases and discharges to the environment. But that opens a big door for regulators for their interpretation. So in this case, they could give a violation and say, I can see the rust staining on the concrete. Clearly, you've not been preventing releases. And that could lead to a potential violation. And then considering even things like, even if you don't have a SWIP, a stormwater plan, still looking ahead, what's a regulator going to see here? We want to try to hold ourselves to a standard to where, again, even if it's not regulatory required, it's still going to make our lives easier in the long run and prevent potential contamination. So from this perspective, elevating the metal. We've got some pallets. We've got these elevated off the ground so we don't just have raw metal sitting directly on the soil, which could potentially lead to, you know, it leaching over time, especially if it's been there for a long time. So again, kind of going above and beyond compliance and trying to get ahead of things, which is going to benefit everybody in the long run. And now this is a good example. So we've got signage. They actually had a locked area for their waste management area. They had emergency numbers. You know, so it's very clear when a regulator walks up what this area is for. First of all, we're limiting access. You know, and then when we actually went in, they actually had designated areas for their different waste streams. So again, anything we can do to give them the warm fuzzies and also benefit our team at the same time is just going to be a win across the board. And then this situation, talk about giving you, the opposite of warm fuzzies, because this is looking pretty heinous right here. Again, may not be a regulatory violation depending on what they're trying to squish into this trash can here, but it looks terrible. So that's going to let that regulator kind of get into that, ooh, that feeling of, I need to look a little bit harder at this facility because it's clear that, they're not really committed to environmental stewardship. If this is a regular practice and this is how your trash areas look. And then also if you have parts stored outside, again, we want to consider, is there oil on those parts, on that material? Because if it rains, like we can see here, what's going to happen? All of that is just going to discharge away. So again, you may not have a SWIP, you may have a SWIP, regardless, we still want to come with this perspective that the regulator may have, who may see this and say, that's potentially leading to a discharge, a release, and it would need to be addressed. And then last photo for this chunk here, again, maybe not a regulatory violation when you got this nasty old, mountain of broken pallets, but it looks ugly and it's not going to sit right during an inspection. And again, it's just not a good look in general for any facility. So, anything we can do to incorporate day-to-day housekeeping, even if it isn't part of your requirements coming straight from the regulations, it's going to trickle down and have an effect on your compliance because everybody's already in that mindset. So it's not like it's that much more work to put on a certain label now, or just to orient those containers in a certain way, or whatever it may be. Oh, I lied to you. I had one more photo. And then avoiding the fence lines. We don't know who's going to be walking by right here, sees this container, and our people may know it's empty. There's that tribal knowledge, but that person walking by is not going to have any idea. And they may then make a phone call and be like, yeah, this facility over here, I've got all these drums stored, and then now you got regulators coming to visit your site. So again, look at it from their perspective. What does that look like? And it doesn't look good. So, assess your waste and product management areas, including the regular trash, your metal recycling, even if you do have bulk tanks, all of that. Again, it's all about that first appearance. Avoid waste or product storage areas where we do have high traffic. We've got drains, we're storing it on the soil or near gravel, waterways. Again, we want to think worst case scenario here. And if we are having to store outdoors, we want to look, where does the rain flow during a rain event? Because that's where your material is going to flow during a spill event. So looking at those pathways and looking, are there any waste or product containers in that pathway? Again, think worst case scenario. Is there a spill? Where's it going to go? Are we ready to respond to that? And we'll look at that here in the last section here in my last 14 minutes I got. But waste and product management areas, again, readily identifiable. They're designated. And even if you aren't required to have a facility map, maybe you're a very small quantity generator, I still highly encourage it. It helps you, and it helps when you get inspected. If you do have product and waste, keep them completely separated. Do not have them mixed together. There should be no question about what's product and waste. Even if you do have product containers, pay attention to primary and secondary containers. Because if there are unlabeled containers at your facility, a waste investigator could still start asking questions about them now because they don't know. Is it product? Is it waste? I don't know. And now you've just expanded the breadth of their investigation. Utilize signage. I'm a big proponent of signage. Again, answering that question up front. What is that? Or a new person, where do I put that? There's signage. They know. Even if you do have empty containers, again, we don't want to have to go and rock each one. Are these empty? Are these not? Have a specific area with signage that says empty containers. And then again, be ready to answer those questions about maintenance of equipment, like filter changeouts for various components around your facility. Maybe it's related to your air permit. Maybe it's related to just a piece of process equipment. Things maybe you hadn't really thought about what people are actually doing with those materials. All right, so third section here, and then we'll wrap it up. So spill preparedness. Are we actually going to be ready for a spill event? So looking at the size and supply of your spill kits around your facility. Do we only have one for this entire operational area? Or can we add a few more and really actually be prepared? Actually having spill response drills, walking with your team, again, where that material would flow if there was a spill, and really getting everybody on board and prepared versus chickens with their head cut off when the real thing actually happens. Can we identify our outfalls and vulnerable waterways up front? And how can we be proactive to protect them? So those are the things that investigators look for and that we're going to look for. So our goal here, show forethought, show proactiveness, and actually, walk the walk and talk the talk, of course, because spills can get very expensive very quickly. I would know that good and well. So even small tweaks up front versus lagging indicators, where we're having to clean up a massive spill. So this is an example of a good practice here, marking your outfalls. Even if you don't have a SWIP, again, you've got a spill or release and it's going to be draining out of a certain outfall, a certain, drainage area, mark it. And again, you got it on a map. So that way you can tell a team member, we've had a spill. I need you to go to outfall number 1 and put down the absorbent boom. Again, just that simple extra step could save you thousands and thousands of dollars and a lot of heartache when it comes to a spill response. Really being, again, going back to prying, we talked about that at the beginning, not really showing any mercy and really asking a lot of questions. This was a facility that I just happened to, we were doing a site walk, but this area back here underneath this awning was supposedly not used anymore. At least that's what we were told. But then when we really started going and squatting down and looking, you can see that there was clearly material inside. And come to find out, it had never even been drained in the first place. This was an old, kind of wash bay area that had been used previously. But at this point, it hadn't been closed up, hadn't been closed off. So it was just continuing to accumulate material plus all the residual from before. So at some point, it had gotten clogged up, and this was essentially going to overflow and overfill, if it had gotten a few more rain events. This was at a site where, again, just being nosy, I was just going around checking all their outfalls, and for whatever reason, and they didn't know why, the facility, why their storm drain was open, or how long it had been open for, or why. So again, we want to look in these areas that maybe sometimes you don't really walk over there, you don't really look over there. Well, go and look, when you're really assessing your facility. Get into every corner, every nook and cranny, because you may find things like this where you're like, okay, that's a little concerning, what's going on here, So things you may miss otherwise. Looking at the size of your spill kits, like we said, do we have enough? Is there even enough supplies inside? So you can see the size of the tanks in the background. That little spill kit isn't going to do a whole lot unless someone's just kind of squirting around. Like otherwise, it's just kind of there out of a formality. Same for this one. This is my favorite spill kit I've ever seen. Quick response, oil spill cleanup kit, emergency use only. And there was like 2 absorbent pads inside. I'm like, I don't know really what that's going to do, but okay. So, again, we want to think realistically and try to give our team that perspective too. That's not going to do anything for us. And if you do have secondary containments, again, this is the type of thing you want to train your team on. That's what makes outdoor storage tough of waste or product containers. You're using containment pallets and it's not covered. You're constantly battling the water in the containment pallet. So maybe you have a spill plan and you have to do, the whole assess for a sheen, see if you can release it or not. It just adds a lot more steps. And then your people may not, you may have a new guy to know any better. And he's like, I'm just going to dump it all out. And then come to find out it had oil sheen on it. Now it's all on the ground. So it's all kind of interrelated. And then staining. Again, what does it look like? So this was old staining, but clearly something went down the drain. Nobody knew what it was, but this is the type of thing, of course, we'd want to make sure that we address up front. Maybe we need to get somebody to come in and clean the concrete. But if that's just left there like that, not to mention the batteries just sitting there in the back right next to the drain, again, we're going to open ourselves up for scrutiny here, and we're potentially, causing a stormwater impact. And again, look in the nooks and crannies of your facility. This was on the outskirts edge of the concrete facility, and clearly you can see this is where their stormwater is draining, and that's all concrete powder residue. Which, of course, now it's draining off-site in the stormwater. Now we're having these discharges. And then when, I pointed it out, they were like, oh, we never really walked over there. And you're like, oh, great. Who knows how long that's been going on for. So, again, really walk the boundaries, the edges of that facility. And again, looking at processes. So this was a piece of equipment that basically would pump from a unit that was right outside of the door and would pump it inside. And this was like a condensate collector, that tote. But get it marked as such, first of all. And then secondly, I recommended some type of flexible berm that would go along that bay door, because I asked them, what are you going to do if something happens here and this disconnects on accident, something breaks? Now you've got that material spraying and spewing. It's going to go right out of that bay door. So again, being proactive, thinking ahead, how can we prevent worst case scenario, even with something as simple as having that flexible berm over there ready to deploy and using it during transfer operations. This facility backed right up to a waterway. They had all sorts of oil tanks and everything else on the right-hand side of that fence, and then that on the left-hand side was a drainage area. And I asked them, how would you get down there if you had a spill from your facility? Because clearly it's going to go right down in there. And they had no idea. They were like, oh, we hadn't even thought about that. I don't know. And so I'm like, well, you probably want to think about that now versus when you've already had the spill event and somebody's having to Spider-Man over the fences. So, again, we want to try to get ahead of it before that day actually comes. Hopefully it won't, but you never know. And then one of my favorite things to always ask is what's going down the drains. So mop water, Zambonis, where do they deposit that material? So we want to go and look at those drains, and you can see here it's looking pretty suspect, not looking so hot. So we want to ask those questions and correct it before the regulator does. Now this situation here, again, all about the placement, and we're thinking ahead. This is a used oil tank. And the system, the drainage coming off of the building actually went right underneath the gutter, underneath that used oil tank. So any spillage they had down the sides of the used oil tank, stormwater would just come through and just wash it right away. And I'm like, don't put that there. Like, first of all, you've got spillage all on the ground, which is not a good situation. Open funnel was not properly labeled, but then you also put it by the gutter, by the drainage system, which just washed away all the contamination. Another process equipment here, they were cutting steel and raw metals right over the stormwater drainage area. And then they were, trying to figure out why they were having exceedances with their stormwater sampling. Well, reverse engineer here. We're going to have to figure something out to protect this area. So, again, you may have a stormwater plan, you may not. But it's still things we want to assess from the regulator's perspective. This was a wash bay. I actually watched them washing vehicles during a rain event, and it was leaving the wash rack and going right into that stormwater drain. So again, sometimes we may need to change the times we're actually assessing ourselves. We may need to do it during a stormwater event. And I'm hustling here because I know I got 4 minutes, but I want to get to the end for my tidbits for you guys for when you get an inspection. Obviously, no bueno, stainage on the ground. And then, like we said, asking, what do you do with your Zamboni water? All questions we want to know up front. So how ready are we for a spill? Do we have spill kits of adequate size and contents? And are we actually checking them monthly? Are they actually still full? Are they easy to find and readily identifiable? Some facilities just use like absorbent pad rolls, but it makes them really hard to find during an emergency. And knowing and training your team on the fact that the spill kit will only get you so far during a spill event. We got to prepare for the worst. We got to know what to do when the worst does come. And your people have gone through some type of drill. Know where your outfalls are. Again, we want to know where's that material going to run off property. And look at your facility from a regulator's perspective during a rain event as well, because it could be pretty revealing. So dig deep and ask those questions. What's actually going into the storm drain, going into the sanitary sewer? And again, maybe some of those peripheral waste we didn't really think about. And if you do have any valves at your facility for sumps, impoundments, know where the shutoff valve is and know where those drains go. So documentation, I'm going to kind of just click through this. One thing I do want to point out is if you do want to check yourself from a regulator's perspective, TCEQ does offer all of their checklists online. So no matter what state you're in, you could actually go in and get these checklists. And most of them are, obviously covering all the federal bases plus the Texas stuff, but you could still use it in your state. And it's great, and I love these because I've used these for many facilities where, again, we go in from the regulator's perspective using their very own checklists, and here it is. And then when you do get an audit, it's almost kind of funny to pull these out if you're, when you're in Texas, of course, and being like, you looking for these? And you've like already done their checklist for them. But it's an awesome way to check yourself. So we want to prepare your team. Again, they know from a regulator's perspective, include them in this. So they know what the regulators are looking for. So they know it's not just you, busting them on stuff. This is truly what the regulators look for. So use those checklists, audit yourself, maintain those checklists if you do get inspected. So that way you can pull them out and be like, this is how we check ourselves. And then again, having those self-assessments is really going to help build that trust. And we want to give them those warm fuzzies we talked about. So have all your documentation ready to rock and roll. We don't want to have to paper shuffle. And your team should know where that paperwork is. It should be readily available and readily accessible. We don't want to be frantic looking, mumbling, trying to find where stuff is, freaking out. So we want to give them those warm fuzzies. That's our biggest goal here upon first inspection is what can we do to make them feel good when they come into our facility, because it is clear we're devoted to compliance. Because if we can get them those warm fuzzies, and as they're looking through our facility, we've got the answers. We know what they were going to ask for, and we've anticipated it. It's going to get them in and get them out, which is what we want. Because again, if we're opening Pandora's box time and time again, the clock's a-ticking. So wrapping it up here, have your inspection plan ready now. So go through, audit yourself from a regulator's perspective. Again, be harsh. Really dig deep and ask those questions, things you may never have asked before, areas you may not normally go. And then follow up on that, of course, with your results, with your team, but also twofold, have an inspection plan ready now. If you do get inspected, whether it's a surprise or a planned investigation. So I usually recommend a 4-person inspection team. I would just already have these people gathered up, designated, they know the drill. So teammate number 1, I always say the chatty Cathy. Somebody who's very friendly, somebody who wants to, who loves to talk. Always a great person to have on an inspection. You want somebody there who's going to be a warm, friendly presence and also just going to, keep the conversation going, which is always helpful. We don't want dead air. And then teammate number 2, the technical expert, the person who has the answers to the regulator's questions. So the chatty Cathy keeps things friendly. The technical expert answers those technical questions. The note taker is the one taking down everything the regulator's taken down, taking the same photos the regulators are taking. So everybody has got their duty here, and that way nothing's getting missed. And then last but not least, the quick fixer. And this person's important because like this goes back to real world. Sometimes regulations are not really written for the real world. Case in point with like the open container situation. Somebody may have just been draining a paint can into a drum with a funnel, literally just put it there. Regulator walks up, they're going to assume it's been there for a day and be like, open container violation. So the quick fixer, while all this office conversation is happening, what are some of your pain points? That's what your quick fixer needs to scuttle around before you ever do the walk around and just make sure there's nothing that looks questionable or could potentially be an issue. So that way, when the first 3 teammates come out there with the regulator, we've just dotted all our I's, crossed all our T's, we're ready to rock and roll. So have this discussion now versus later. Get these people identified. And that way when the regulators show up, you're like, all right, it's game time. Like we've planned for this. We know what to do. We know we're in compliance. If there is anything we can quickly fix that's easy, get that done. And then that way when the walk around comes, let's rock it out. So final tidbit. Yep. No tribal knowledge, no historical knowledge. Again, that's one of our biggest faults sometimes is we get too wrapped up into that. So we overlook it. We don't even see it anymore. No assumptions and assume the worst. What is that regulator going to think when they see it? Utilize that critical prying eye and don't factor in those emotions or those excuses. And with that, I hustled 102. So hopefully you guys got some good tidbits out of that. Like I said, I could talk about it all day long. But if you want any free hazmat stickers, I got a bunch of them on my website. So if you want to shoot me an email, I'd be more than happy to send you more than 2. I usually send a bunch more. I got a bunch of fun ones on there. But I really appreciate being able to present to you guys. Like I said, hopefully you got little tidbits out of it. And does anybody have any questions? I don't know if you can come off mute or not, but if you have any questions, feel free to jump off mute. Nope. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining. Like I said, I had a great time. I love talking about this stuff. So if you want a copy of the presentation, feel free to email me as well. I can definitely share that with you. But yeah, thank you guys so much. Oh, someone said, I don't think we can come off mute. Gotcha. Okay. All right. Oh, I'll drop my email right here in the chat. So yeah, if you want a copy of the presentation, feel free to shoot me a message. Thank you. I appreciate that. All right, guys, I'm going to jump off, grab my email if you need it. Hope you have a great rest of your week. Great weekend.